A joint report by investigative organization, the Sentry, and non-profit organization Open Secrets has revealed how Zimbabwean presidential advisor Kudakwashe Tagwirei illegally moved funds to London from the country. It's alleged that South African and Mauritian people played a crucial role in assisting him to move the money. We're now joined by Marchant, head of research at Open Secrets, for more on this explosive investigation. Thank you very much, Michael, for your time this afternoon. And so, how did this all come about?
Afternoon, Dudu, and afternoon to those watching. So the investigation, a collaborative project between Open Secrets and the Sentry, really came about on the basis of evidence that was presented to us and other journalists by a whistleblower who had been part of this scheme from the very beginning, a South African professional who had been a director of one of the companies involved. That individual later became a whistleblower and left with a huge amount of evidence detailing complicated payments, company structures, directors, and correspondence between the people involved. And what that evidence showed to us, and what we've written about in this story, is how, as you've mentioned, this very prominent businessman and presidential advisor in Zimbabwe, Kudakwashe Tagwirei, was able to purchase mines from a United Kingdom-based company, but through quite a complex way, by moving money via Mauritius through a company that was run by South African directors, seemingly on his behalf. And so the story really tells how there were a range of people on all sides of these borders in South Africa, Mauritius, the United Kingdom, that we believe knew very clearly that Kudakwashe Tagwirei was the individual behind the deal and was essentially helping him to pull it off.
To the knowledge of the highest office in the land?
It certainly appears that that is the case. As I've said, we've got detailed evidence and behind-the-scenes look at how these individuals were speaking. And there's various reasons we suspect that very senior politicians, perhaps up to the president in Zimbabwe, were certainly aware of and sanctioned the deal. At one point, for example, there's correspondence from Tagwirei himself in WhatsApp correspondence indicating that HE, understood to be His Excellency President Mnangagwa, wants the deal to go ahead quickly, and that people involved are answerable ultimately to him. And we also know from reporting by Zimbabwean investigative journalists and others over the last few years that Kudakwashe Tagwirei and his companies are deeply enmeshed in party politics in Zimbabwe, and that he's benefited from many contracts. The last thing I'll say in this regard is that it does so happen that after the period that we look at in the report, which kind of ends in 2020, Tagwirei's firm Sotic successfully buys the mines, but very soon after that, those mines are then transferred to another Zimbabwean company, Kuvimba, and that is majority owned by the Zimbabwean state, and today the Zimbabwean state does appear to hold majority ownership of those mines. And so there is all those indications, I think, point to the knowledge and involvement of senior politicians there.
Do we then characterize this as illicit financial outflows from that country? And if so, how much is Zimbabwe bleeding?
So this is one transaction, but we think it's emblematic of a far greater problem. And so in this instance, we are still talking about tens of millions of US dollars that were obtained by one of Tagwirei's companies at a very favorable exchange rate from the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. And as we've said, funneled out of that country through Mauritius and ultimately to the benefit of a company and its administrators in the United Kingdom. But as we've said, a far bigger problem. Most experts estimate, and this is a broad sum, that anywhere between 500 million US dollars and $1 billion US dollars every year bleeds from Zimbabwe. And we know that it's very difficult to access foreign currency there, and we know that that country is suffering from hyperinflation and a depressed economy. And I think that this is just one more indication, I think, of the risks of the resources of that country being funneled out of it, but also to take us back to the beginning, how it isn't just about those in Zimbabwe who are undertaking this kind of conduct. It's all the people in South Africa, Mauritius, and elsewhere who create the enabling environment for those flows to happen.
We'll get into that in a moment, because I just want to address this notion or this narrative that is created that Zimbabwe is under sanctions, and it is particular individuals that are being sanctioned here. How are they able to move this money?
So Kudakwashe Tagwirei is currently under US and UK-based sanctions, but he was not at the time of this transaction, just to be clear.
Okay.
But it does raise, I think, quite a fundamental point, and it's one that we come to in the report, is that despite the fact that Tagwirei wasn't sanctioned at the time, he was certainly clear to keep his name out of the formal structures that were involved in this regard. And so up until today, the Mauritian company agent, for example, Capital Horizons Limited, that established SOTIC, the Mauritian company, they and others maintain that this was not Kudakwashe Tagwirei's company. But they maintain it despite extensive evidence in emails and other correspondence that we've seen of the directors of SOTIC, those South Africans, taking instructions from Tagwirei about the appointment of directors, about what transactions to implement. And at one point, one of those directors openly saying in correspondence and calling himself a front for Tagwirei. And so I think, Judy, to answer your question, is that both pre-sanctions but also post-sanctions, there's always a risk that individuals of this nature are able to use front companies and companies in different jurisdictions. And of course, in South Africa, as well as Zimbabwe and other places, it's incredibly difficult to know who the beneficial owners are of companies. You can know who the directors are, but you don't always know who's behind them. And it's one of the reasons that introducing a beneficial ownership registry that the public can access is such an urgent priority in all of these countries.
Oh my, there's a completely different world one has no idea about, because that's my next question. Who are these enablers? Because it's Zimbabwe today, tomorrow it's Mauritius, the next day it's Tanzania, the next day it's Dubai. Who are they?
So I think that the reality is, and this is something that we have to grapple with, is that the enablers or the facilitators are a range of people across the globe, the professionals, the lawyers, the accountants, the bankers and others who conduct business every day, some of it legitimate, but some of it not. And I think that we are increasingly aware, South African state capture was an example of this, but this case is another example of it, that it is so crucial that those professionals are regulated by their regulatory bodies and that they are meeting all of their due diligence and reporting requirements. I think there's no lack of knowledge across these jurisdictions now that there's a great deal of risk of lawyers, accountants, bankers, again, undertaking activities for individuals without properly screening either who they are or knowing who they are, but not reporting suspicious activity quickly enough to the authorities. And so this is just one more example that raises how important it is not only to focus on the direct beneficiaries of allegations of corruption or state capture, but the broader architecture, those people who facilitate, for example, the movement of the funds, the establishment of companies and structures, and often who come up with these financial acrobatics, essentially, these ways of moving monies across jurisdictions in such ways to hide the real purpose of the transaction.
Is it safe to say that these financial acrobats are part of the reason why South Africa is grey listed? So when you speak of a registry of beneficial ownership, is this one of the things that it will take to get South Africa off that grey list?
It's a great link to make, because I think that this is exactly the kind of thing that has got South Africa onto the FATF grey list. A beneficial ownership registry is certainly one step that we need to take. But if we listen to what the FATF has been saying, particularly since we've been put on the grey list, is that there's one thing more important than the changes of the laws and the introduction of the registry. And that's that our law enforcement authorities investigate and, where appropriate, prosecute these types of activities. And that, I think, is the gap that we're still seeing across the board, is our law enforcement authorities don't seem to have the skills, the resources, and the will to tackle these often very complicated financial flows and financial crimes. And yet they have to. The FATF has made it very clear that our authorities seeking more collaboration with other jurisdictions about these types of crimes, starting investigations, but also seeing through regulatory action and prosecutions where appropriate. That's the only thing really that's going to get us off that list. And so that really is what we need to see. We need to see action from those institutions and individuals.
Michael, please do allow me to digress, but I'm just curious. So beyond the books, what is being done with this money? For instance, are people buying expensive cars, but there's no roads to drive them on? Are people, because the roads are so poor, are people, what are they doing with these monies? Are they buying houses in the UK, but here they are sanctioned in the UK? What are they doing with this senseless amount of money?
So I think that if we look at an individual like Kudakwashe Tagwirei, for example, it's certainly true that he appears to have an extraordinarily luxurious home in Zimbabwe, and there's no doubt that some of that money from deals like this, we can't say for sure whether any of the money from this deal went into something like that, but deals like this have benefited him in that way. But I think maybe the more kind of crucial point to realize here, it takes us back to that question you asked right at the beginning, is what was the role of the Zimbabwean state? And we see in allegations of state capture in South Africa, Zimbabwe, is that these money flows benefit both the individual business people who are involved, but a lot of it also is about having some of that money ultimately perhaps going to party politics or political leaders. And there's certainly evidence before this transaction of Tagwirei, for example, being a donor in Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwean media have made allegations about, for example, him providing cars to ZANU-PF officials and conduct of that nature. And so I think it's really about understanding networks such as these and how the benefits there's such a close overlapping interest, I think, between the private individuals and the public authorities that they are working with.
Thank you so much, Michael, for your time this afternoon. Head of Research at Open Secrets, Michael Marchant.